members was a little too sharp, but the statement at the beginning I thought was pretty raw, but in keeping with someone who had been unjustly accused.
That was Jeff Flake on 60 Minutes from last night. Stephen Roberts joins us, ABC News political analyst in Washington, D.C. Good morning, Stephen.
Hey, pal.
All right, so it seems like there was a bit of bipartisanship breaking out on Friday between Jeff Flake and Senator Coons.
There was, and it's so notable because it's so rare in the U.S. Senate. You know, I covered the Senate for most of 8 years for the New York Times in the 80s, and there was, sure, partisanship is an essential part of American politics. It's a healthy part of American politics. But at the same time that partisans disagree, the tradition has been that on some level they respect each other. They respect the institution they serve. They have relationships across party lines that lubricate the business of the Senate. But what's happened in the last generation is that lubrication, that respect, has almost entirely disappeared. And you saw it on display on Friday where senators got up before that moment of bipartisanship, accusing each other of dishonesty, accusing each other of deceit. Lindsey Graham screaming at Democrats saying, all you want is to grab power, and I hope to God you never get it. This is so outside the bounds of the traditions of the U.S. Senate. If you go back to the McCain funeral just a few weeks before, that was almost an elegy for the Senate that used to exist. McCain had been very much throughout his career, reached across the aisle, worked with Democrats, and chose two Democrats as two of his eulogists. Not only Joe Lieberman, his best friend from the Senate, who was a Democrat from Connecticut, but Barack Obama, the man who defeated him for the presidency. And you fast forward just a few weeks later, and you see that scene in that committee, and you see how drastically the U.S. Senate has changed, McGraw.
I thought it was interesting. It was almost a throwaway line, Senator Flake, last night on 60 Minutes when he was asked, you're not running for re-election. If you were, could you have done this? And he said, no, I couldn't have done this. Nobody gets credit for bipartisanship anymore.
Well, that's true. And there's a much longer range factor here, which is the decline of two very important and vibrant traditions in American politics. Progressive Republicans, many of whom came from New England and the Pacific Northwest, but occasionally from the Midwest. I would include former Senator John Danforth very much in that tradition, and conservative Southern Democrats. Those were the two groups that were often the bridge builders, the consensus makers, the deal makers, the people who worked and reached across the aisle on a regular basis. Both of those traditions have shrunk badly. You look at Susan Collins of Maine; she's the only Republican left in the Senate from New England, when there used to be 3, 4, 5, 6 of them who were very important in the life of the U.S. Senate, including a man named Prescott Bush, who was the father and grandfather of presidents, who was a senator from Connecticut. So it's not just the short term. There's a very serious long-term trend which is hollowing out the middle of the U.S. Senate.
Let's talk midterms for a second, Stephen Roberts, because you're watching these polls like a hawk. So depending on what happens with Kavanaugh, if Kavanaugh gets rejected for whatever reason, is that going to energize the right? And if Kavanaugh is confirmed, is that going to energize the left?
I think no matter what happens with Kavanaugh, it's going to have a major political impact, but I think they're not always the same. I think in a state like Missouri, frankly, where a Democrat, Claire McCaskill, is up for re-election in a close race, the Kavanaugh case could help Republicans. I think whether he's accepted or rejected, just the importance of the Supreme Court as an issue could energize the conservative base of the Republican Party, because the court is so central as an issue for so many conservatives, and particularly religious conservatives. At the same time, I think in many of the House races that are going to be the key races are going to be conducted in the suburbs of Chicago and Denver and Philadelphia, it could help Democrats. We already see a drift, a very significant drift, away from Republicans on the part of college-educated white women. I saw a Fox News poll which showed that this group, college-educated white women, opposed Kavanaugh, and this was before Friday, opposed Kavanaugh by 60 to 34. That's an enormous margin, McGraw. So there could be two different and contradictory effects, depending on the state, depending on the race, depending on the candidate.
Just so I understand, you think that this Kavanaugh story hurts McCaskill in the state of Missouri?
It could, if it energizes conservatives who have not been as intense or as interested in the election. And one of the reasons why a president's party almost always loses seats in an off-year election is because people are not as energized as they were during the campaign. They're not as excited as they were. Trump was a very exciting figure for his supporters, and all the polls have showed a drop-off in intensity. But you got to remember how important the court is to conservative voters. I looked at the exit polls, McGraw, and 21% of Americans in the last election said the court was the single most important issue they cared about. And they voted for Trump overwhelmingly by about 20 points. And if you look at people who would describe themselves as born-again or evangelical Christians, of which there were 26% of Americans, 80% of them voted for Trump.
Yeah.
Now, if this court, if the publicity around the Kavanaugh issue gets some of those voters to the polls who might not have voted, it could hurt McCaskill, definitely.
Stephen Roberts, ABC News political analyst. You're the best. Thanks for checking in on a busy Monday.
Sure.